Hi, I'm Josh, Managing Director from Workflow Power. We're a gold channel partner and an advanced delivery partner, having implemented Monday across hundreds of organizations around Australia, APAC, and New Zealand. And really here today to run you through how you can build a solution in Monday.com for your accounting or bookkeeping organization. So we're not just going to run through, what it looks like. We're actually going to build it live so you can follow along and do it yourself if you want to kind of get up to speed with why we would build this structurally in this particular way. And we're going to run through some tips on what's the best way to approach it, how you can see how like our approach to kind of foundationally stack on top of that initial structure. And if you want to get access to this full solution installable in your account, there should be a link in the description of this video below that you can access and install it along with customization instructions, screen share videos, documentation. Really easy to kind of get started. Today, we really want to showcase structure and get you on board in terms of building out this solution. So let's get into how we would do it and start building it out. Now, the first thing, obviously, that we want to do is create a new workspace. That workspace can be anything you want. I'm just going to create a new one called Accounting Demonstration. And within our workspace, what we're really kind of focusing on, or the things that we want to look at, is how we will structure it to be really clean. I think organization of workspace is really great, but also how you can organize that workspace to scale. So looking at, are we going to add more workflows? Are we going to build out a structure that makes sense? What's the visibility look like? So when we look at our accounting and bookkeeping structure, building our workspace will be our first step. I always like to add a description into a workspace, potentially look at, a cover. All those kind of things can just make a slight difference to the visibility and what that looks like. Now, after we've got our workspace set up, the next thing that we would want to do is really lean on like what our folder structure would be. Now, I like to start with folders when I'm building out any kind of new workflow, or we build one out internally for what we're looking at. And folders really organize the workspace and to keep it simple, easy to access, ensuring that people know what's what. So you can see here as we go through, we're starting to create some new folders here, giving us identification for essentially what each part of that workflow will do. Here we're creating a database, boards for each service, boards for each period, and boards for each team. And then finally, a reporting folder. What I can also do, and what I like to do, and we like to do as a team, is like color our folders. Just adds a bit of kind of highlight to that particular workspace. You can add things like emojis to brighten up kind of what that looks like. Now, once we have our folder structure defined, and again, you can have folders in folders and all those kind of things. Personally, I like to just kind of keep it simple initially when it comes to structure, and then ladder in different things that we want to create off the back of that. Now, what I'm going to do firstly is I'm going to start with my database or my foundational structure. Now, this is when looking at this particular workflow, you can either build in Monday CRM as well, that lead flow and that database structure, and we have a solution built exactly the same that leverages the CRM. You can look at integrating. You can also look at, running this solely kind of in Monday. What we really want to focus on here is like capturing some key data, like the group. We're also looking at entities, and then we're also looking at contacts. So at our group level, what we're going to do is we're going to modify this existing board, and we are going to kind of set up some information in there that would make sense when looking at how we want to track it. For example, at our group level, our group is really designed to be, okay, where are we going to track things where multiple entities are connected, contacts, it might be 2 companies, an SMSF, trust, individuals, and that's where we want to ladder it up to here. So we'd create a simple group, call it active. We would then go and just add in some sample groups. So again, you can create whatever groups that you would like and what makes sense. We've just created a really simple active one here. You could create active, inactive, you could create onboarding, you can create all types of different structures that make sense. And here we're just going to create some simple groups. You might already be using a group structure in your organization. It might be part of like your practice management software or something similar. So different ways you could integrate that data in can be really useful and powerful. In this example, we're just going to start with listing out some simple groups and putting them in our board. Once we have those different groups defined, we're going to add one simple column to start with, which will be a people column. And that can be to help us track who is like the client manager or essentially responsible for that group ongoing, and how they can kind of deliver, or we can report on what they're delivering across different groups. Now, once this is kind of set up, you can see as we add in our different groups that are connected, we could create names for them, we could create IDs, we could do a whole bunch of different things really easily. We can also obviously add different columns on top of the client manager. It might not be, you might want more columns than that at a group level. It just really depends. The next thing that I want to do is look at my entities board. And when I look at my entities board, this is where I'm going to start tracking different information as opposed to my groups. So at my entity level, this is where we would have companies, trusts, self-managed super funds, all those type of organizational entity structures that we want to essentially report on, link to our groups, but also initiate workflows on. So in this example, we'll still do the same thing. Let's rename our group to active. We'll go through and we'll add some sample entities. So again, this could be as simple as just linking in what those companies are. It might be importing them into a specific structure. You might want to integrate them, or you might be rolling out this solution connected to a CRM or within Monday CRM. So you can see here, I'm just listing out the different types that we have. So whether that's a company, maybe a trust structure, all different types of entities that we can add in here. Once we have our entities kind of loaded in, what we'll be looking at then doing is adding some additional columns. We'll have our column that is our client manager column that will kind of stay consistent, because if we wanted to report on, see on like who's in control of what, clients over what, we can set that up and see that really easily. We can then also start to think about, okay, well, do we want to initiate workflow from this point? I like to think of the database structure as like a static hub of information, and our workflows revolve around it. Those workflows always sync into this, so we can report on it, we can filter on it, we can group it, all that kind of nice stuff. Again, here you can see I've got my client manager column, and I'm starting to get some buttons here for my workflow 1, 2, and 3. And we'll run through and come back to how we can link those in really easily to initiate our workflow. The next thing that we'd want to do is we're going to go through and look at our contacts board. Our contacts board is going to be where we start to look within our database folder and start to link those individual people where we want to kind of track their information. So as we go into our contacts board, again, similar structure. We'll start off really easily. We'll just put in active, and then we will start to list out some of those individuals that can be connected into this workflow. We'll then add some additional columns. Again, I think at a contact level, you really wouldn't want to put the contacts in with the entities. It can mix up some of the data, also enabling like connection issues, especially when you kind of want to report on what contacts are related to what entity. So it's a good idea to kind of split them out into their own thing. What we do know is that obviously individuals will get their own workflows. So they'll have things like tax returns, financials, tax, all that kind of stuff that we want to track. So we want to include that same workflow initiation point. So the ability to trigger off things for our individuals, just like we would trigger them off for our entities. So after we've got a few contacts in there, you can see that we've started to list a few in here already. We're then going to go down and we're going to start to create some of those columns that are going to make sense within our workflow. Again, always starting with our people column, then you can track and assign people to own a contact, to own an entity, who own a group. Really useful when triggering off workflows, and you can take that data with you, filtering and reporting on it. So you can see as we start to build out these columns, we can start to vary some of the data we collect. Maybe we want to know what their role is, their position in that kind of organization, email address, maybe we want to know, phone number, and then we can actually start to link in like what our workflow options are. So workflow 1, where we want to create that button that's going to initiate it. Same for 2, and same for 3, which are going to connect down to our different folders here, which we're going to highlight. Now, once we've got this set up, we've got group, we've got entities, we've got contacts. The next thing we want to do is we want to connect these together. So I'm going to use a connect boards column at the group level, and I'm going to connect it to my entity, and I'm going to create a two-way connection. I'm then going to do another one, and I'm going to do this one connected to my contacts. So I'm going to create a two-way connection here, and I can see now I've got entities and contacts linked in. With that two-way connection, it's created another column over here in my entities board, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a mirror column from here, and I'm going to mirror in my contact. So I'm going to put in contacts, they're connected to that group, and then I'm going to do the same down at my contacts level. So I'm going to say group here, and then I'm going to say what entities they're linked to. So this lets me keep a whole data set of information and keep it all connected. So as I go into my group board, maybe this has 2 entities connected to it, and it has 1 contact. This one below might have 1 entity, and it might have 2 contacts. We can also do this connection point at the entity board, but you can see what it's pulling in. It lets me see, okay, well, in my entities, what group is connected to what here really easily. And then I can filter this, so I could go, well, what's in my group, like what entities, so I can say for that group, I just want to see what those entities are. And that becomes really powerful as a connection point across your workflow. Again, I can see that same information down in my contacts. Now, once we have that established, that's really a foundational structure point, and you can see how quick and easy it was for us to work through that. Now, again, as we go through this, we're going to focus on structure primarily in this video, how you can build out the structure that makes sense, highlight some key automations, but really if you want to get this fully fledged solution you can customize and build yourself, you'll find it in the description below. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go, what are the 6 boards that I want in this kind of service, each service workflow. Now, as you see, the names kind of pretty much explain what they are. For each service we're looking at, we're going to have one overview board, which is going to be our master, which is where we're going to sync our entities and our contacts to initiate workflow. We're going to get a zoomed out picture. We're then going to have a workflow board for each of our services. Now, this is something you can easily scale out and grow. Start with one service, add new services. Duplication become really powerful here. Keeping structure and foundation really simple, and trying to ensure that you keep consistency around the way that you're building the workflow. Now, when we go through these different options, it's really, useful to look at, well, maybe I want boards for each service, but I also want a time period board for my daily and ad hoc tasks, or I want a team board. There's different ways you can combine and mix this up so it becomes a hybrid workflow. Once we've got our boards created here, so you can see we've got our 6 boards created in this folder. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to start to work on our overview board in terms of structure. Now, this really becomes a key point within our workflow to summarize, zoom out, get that big picture of exactly what's going to happen for that particular client or that subset of clients. good starting point, and I always, a big fan of the high level, low level structure where it makes sense, just to simplify workflow, but also to stage gate it and provide visibility. That visibility can be useful at different levels depending on how you want to use it. Now, you can see as our groups get created here, you can obviously have your own groups. Let's move them into their particular right order. Let's give them some colors that make sense. And let's remove any kind of groups that aren't applicable. We'll then go through and obviously start to think about the columns here. So as we add in a client, we'll show you how this becomes automated. We would want to obviously track manager, who's responsible for that client. We probably want to set up like a status that's connected to those different groups there. And then we may want to look at our next automation is how we're going to trigger work. So how we're going to push work across to our workflow boards really easily. Now, once we've got that overview base structure set up really simply, we're going to go down into one of our workflow boards. So we're going to go down into our BAS board, and we're going to start to create this workflow. So let's think about now we've got an overview. We've got different service boards where the work is going to get executed. And we've got that all laddering up to our database being our group entities contact style structure. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do here is start to think about groups again. Always start to think of that approach of hierarchy, workspace, folders, boards, groups, and then columns. And that can all then just flow very seamlessly into the way that you want to create that board and that workflow. Like I touched on before, keeping consistent approach to naming conventions, structure of columns will ensure that you don't, run like wild in terms of what that looks like, especially when you've got a fairly consistent approach in terms of what that work looks like here. So let's move some of these around so we've got the right structure. Let's give it some different colors so it makes sense. Let's put this in review to up here. Let's make our on hold, let's make it a red color. And let's put our completed here to this one, and then we'll change this to a different kind of green color. Now, once we've got that set up, we'll start to build out some columns. Again, what we're doing here is we're going to have clients, and we'll show you how this is automated. In this example, we might have our job manager, our job lead. We might also start to capture different data at a column level. Our status, always aligned to our groups where automations can push it through automatically, is super useful and powerful. Due dates, estimated time, actual time, things we can track at sub items could be those different tasks and activities that are happening within that workflow. I love the checklist style format for this particular workflow, so things can get ticked off really easily and repeated for the next cycle. You can have formulas. We can have columns that represent repeating workflows that can drive automations around different periods, ensuring that you kind of get that seamless loop for that particular cycle, depending on if that happens again and again for that client. Now, once we've got this set up, we've got our overview, which becomes our master. We've got our workflow board where we execute the activities. We then want to create some of those connection points. So let's create a connect boards column to our entities and contacts. So we can link that through and initiate workflow from that point. So let's call this entities and contacts. Here, maybe we want to filter on the group. So let's mirror in the group. So we can go here, group, and put it like that. And let's call it group. We can also, again, our next connection point is going to be down. So we've gone up to our database structure. Now we're going down to our workflows. We want to create a separate connection for each of those workflow boards. And we want to create a mirror column here. So we're going to mirror in that job status. So I'm going to say, this is my BAS status. Maybe I move it over to here and I've got that kind of set up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back up and I'm going to show you how we can initiate workflow. Again, we've got these buttons here. We can go here and we can customize this button. Again, you could use a status, you could use another trigger. It doesn't have to be a button. And we're going to set this up. We're going to say when that's clicked, we're going to create an item. in board and connect boards. So I'm going to create an item in my overview, and let's find the right one. And then we're going to connect both boards with that column, and we're going to give it a name. We're going to just keep it that same name. So we're going to create that. That's then our automation linked to our entity. If we want to initiate contacts, we do the same thing. So we can see we've got this set up really easily here. Let's rename this column to overview 1. What we can then do is go, okay, well, this particular entity, we want to trigger off or initiate them into our workflow cycle. What that will do is it create an item automatically over here. It gives us a linkage here to what that group is and that entity. So you can see there, it's got the entity, it's got the group, meaning we can ladder data back up. We can report on it really easily. The next thing we want to do is we've got a summarized view of clients. These are clients who we're going to push into our workflow. They're linked to a static database that we potentially want to report on, one central source of truth. We may then now want to initiate our workflow. So we're going to create an automation here, and we're going to call it when status changes to, use our trigger work option, changes to BAS. Again, we're going to create item in board and connect boards. So we're going to create an item in our BAS, and we're going to connect both boards. We're going to give this an item name, and then we're going to connect it with BAS. Maybe we could just put something on here like a hyphen and a BAS. Let's create that. What that's going to do is that's going to give us now a connection point. So we're going to say, okay, for now, we need to push them into a BAS workflow. We can see that's going to create that item down in here. So we've now got the workflow where our work is executed. Our automations can be tied to, okay, well, it's a quarterly period. We can set them automatically if we want to. We can say it's repeating. It's where we can add our checklist as sub items. We can assign, and we can start working this through a particular cycle. What's really powerful with this is the ability to kind of see this data sync back up. So where you've got a client in your overview that has multiple different types of work that's getting executed. It's being done in their own workflow boards that different people or one person can own, and it's summarizing back up to here so I can see it really easily. If we were to go through and add another service board, again, this is something that you may potentially want to do from a duplication perspective rather than a creation perspective, but this gives you the capability to go down and do the same thing. So you're essentially creating other service boards that represent different streams of work. So in this example, we're pushing down our pay-as-you-go structure in the very similar way. So we're going to create our groups in the exact same way, the same groups. Again, they could be slightly different if you want them to be. The flexibility that this provides is that you can vary how those workflows are run and structured while maintaining consistency. So you put in a box and you provide flexibility inside that box. So as our groups get created, we're going to maybe update the colors. So let's update the colors so we can move them around. So we can get the right kind of structure that we want to see. Let's move approved down to here. Let's give our in review a different color, and then let's move our completed down to here. We can put our on hold maybe to orange, and then let's change in review to something else. Now let's delete our old group here, and then we're going to start adding columns. We're going to basically add the same columns as we did on the other board, and we can see now how those columns will start filling out, being our client manager. We might then go down and obviously do the job lead and all those different boards that make sense. As we build out this column structure, again, you can modify it to suit the way you want to work. We're going to go back up and we are going to look at how can we connect now to that new workflow. We're going to create another connect boards column. We're going to connect it to our pay-as-you-go, create a two-way connection, and then we're going to create a mirror column directly from here, and we're going to mirror in our pay-as-you-go status. Now, I'm going to drag this across here. What I can also do at this point is start to hide some of the data. I don't need to see those connect board columns, so I'm just going to save a default view. So let's rename this view to like main view, and let's pin it so it's the first thing we see. And we might also want to lock it so people can't filter it and change it. That will then give us the ability to see the status, but we don't need to see the connection points there at all. Our final thing we do is we go through, we've got an automation already. Let's duplicate it. Let's call it pay as you go. And then we're going to create an item in, we'll find that workflow board, and then we'll connect those boards together, and let's connect them with pay as you go. And let's change this name here. So you can see how when we're looking at structure, that's really should be our primary focus before we start getting fancy with all the data and the different things that workflow needs to do. Coming back to what's the foundational structure that's going to make sense. Now we go back to our pay as you go board. We've got our columns created here. We've got our kind of data set up in the right way, so it's going to kind of link through. And then in our overview, we're simply kind of just triggering that automation as well. So we'll trigger pay as you go. That will do the same thing in terms of automations to run down and connect. We've got our creation there of that particular workflow. We can now see, okay, well, our pay as you go for this client is in progress. Our BAS is in review. Zoomed out view is super powerful to give you that status snapshot of what's happening. Good for reporting, tracking time, summarizing it up, but also workflow initiation points. So just don't discount how effective that structure could be to provide visibility. What we're going to do now is go through and show essentially how you could do this same thing with different types of structures. So in the next example, what we would look at is, here's our boards for, potential periods. So this is where we might have, again, still our master overview, but instead of having service boards layered down, we might have time periods that represent different information for like our monthly tasks, our daily and ad hoc, our quarterly, our half yearly, and our annual, and all that kind of stuff. So this is just a different way, while using a similar structure, you could start to figure out how this could potentially work to make it easy for you based on your workflow. Again, one of the most common ways is you might want to push daily and ad hoc into this structure where you have service boards as well. Or you might want to have a particular service board that sits on top of those time-based boards as well. There's no real right way to do it. Obviously, the right structure is maintain that overview, no matter kind of which approach that you're going for. So we're going to create some updates in our overview 2 board here. So we're going to look at how we can create a similar structure. We'll look at creating new groups, very similar to what we did before. We're going to create some columns, but instead of our trigger to create work that's going to ladder down into our service boards, we're going to create triggers that now move down into our period boards here that we can then track and create different views based on those requirements. Again, as our groups get created, let's move them around. Maybe we want to change the colors of how they're structured, and look at how kind of simple that can be to set up. Once we've got our groups, we'll just delete anything that's not applicable. Start with a kind of blank base and slate of information that we want to track, and then we'll start adding those columns that make sense. Client manager, always obviously number 1, and then looking at those other key status columns, the job type columns, and then getting us a starting point in terms of what our workflow can look like. Once we have those columns created, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go down and we're going to look at our monthly board. So for our monthly board, some key things here that we'd want to track, and some kind of slight differences that potentially you would look at as opposed to our boards for each service, is the ability to kind of create different views as well within that. So those views can be super useful to be able to trigger the way you want to work. Also, It can be super powerful when looking at like how does that make sense in the way that you're kind of doing it or executing that work at the same time. So the monthly view can be powerful, and it can really simplify what you're trying to achieve. The first things that we would do, again, if you've been following through structure is kind of the thing that I'll harp on the most, is taking the logical approach with groups first, starting with like what those groups should be, how are they going to align to your workflow, add value, add visibility. Once you've got your groups established, you're then going to be looking at like what are the columns that make sense and linking in that kind of sample data. So in this example here, we've got obviously very similar groups to what we did before when looking at our service board workflow. So we're going to, potentially give these some different colors and structure them in a logical way that makes sense for how we're working. Now, I'm going to push this one down here, mark it as completed, and set it as blue. We're going to delete our old group, and then we're going to add the columns here. One of the main differences you'll see in this workflow is when we're looking at a client coming in, you'd set up your overview in the same way. Client's going to push in from your overview, link to your entity or your contact. You're going to have your status column here, but instead of having a single type of job in here, you're going to have multiple types. So for client Y, I might have Baz, and for client Y, I might also have pay as you go. So you got a difference point there where everything is sitting in a monthly board for multiple clients initiated from your overview. The way that you can kind of, simplify this as well is very similar to thinking about the structure of your board for each service, is to create views that are filtered by that particular service type. So we might have Baz here, and then we might have another one here that's pay as you go. So we have an all view, and then we filter that based on that particular workflow or that type of activity that's been undertaken. So you can see here how this gives us an all view. We can then layer it down across our different types of work. So very similar to our board for each service, but just visualized differently. So instead of us going down board by board, we're going across a monthly board and looking at those different activities. Again, we would connect our monthly overview, to our monthly board. So we connect it, we create a two-way connection, and that's when we can start to mirror in that information. So I can say customize here, and I'll add in a mirror and our mirroring status. With our client Y, that we might initiate automatically from our entities or contacts board and then trigger this creation automatically. Obviously, we're going to get stacked here in terms of like what's connected to it. So we're going to start to see some different data in this view as we put this into in progress, and maybe our Baz one is on hold. In our overview, we'll get some slightly different data. As we click on it, we can see for our client Y, the pay as you go is in progress, and they've got stuff on hold in their monthly cycle. Can be a good viewpoint, super useful and easy to use, and can give you that kind of clarity that makes sense in that structure as well. What I really like about this one is you can still get that service view. You can still combine the data into your overview and it become really useful to use. And you can split out different periods. You can also combine the periods together, monthly, quarterly, all that kind of stuff can be super useful to do. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a team structure. So for those larger organizations where it may make sense to kind of push it into teams, or you're tracking work by teams, you can have a board for each team structure, and that approach will focus on how you're going to like set up your overview and then structure your teams underneath. We're also in this example looking at a very similar type of approach to our monthly structure, where we're classifying these into their own kind of dedicated views. Where we don't have our team, for example, split up by monthly, quarterly tasks, or service types. They're going to be just aggregated into that full team, so it's got their entire work of things they need to execute. The first thing that we would do, again, as we go through and build this out, is always going to be our overview. That's always our starting point. It's going to be the key thing that we kind of leverage all the time, no matter what workflow we use. We'll start with that high level zoomed out view, and we'll start with the groups by building out the groups that make sense to that particular workflow. What some people like to do here as well, potentially, is structure the overview into teams. So you can see visually like what team A, what team B, what team C is working on. So in this example, we've popped it in as ready to commence, in progress, archived, but we could drag these up. We could modify them. We could say this is team A. We could say this is team B. And then we could say this is team C. There's really no limit on how you want to structure that workflow depending on what makes sense. I think at an overview level, you can really do whatever you want. With the team approach, that overview does make sense if you want to structure it in this way. We'd obviously add our own clients' information in here. So initiating from our entities or contacts board, we've got our status here. This could also represent team, or it could just represent status and where they're sitting. And then we've got to commence work, like what team are we going to trigger that into? Our next step is, again, we would go down and we would create in our team boards. So one team as a starting point is always super useful. We can start with team A. It can be a duplication then that you go through and execute that same structure for each of those teams. Again, some key highlights here: the ability to do repeating tasks, ensure that one board can capture everything ongoing. You don't need to kind of recreate tasks automatically. We have the built-in automations in our solution to achieve that. Leveraging sub-items, is really useful in this type of structure for, task management or checklist management. And then again, we can structure our groups in a way that makes sense depending on our requirements. Let's move these around. Let's put on hold underneath here. And then we've got our approved one that we want to drag down. Let's give it a different color. And then we've obviously got our final kind of completed depending on what we finish. Once we've got our groups established, going through that methodical kind of approach to building out, we're going to look at the columns. I would suggest, again, keeping the columns very consistent based on the different teams. But what is super useful in this type of structure is that different teams may want different data in different boards and they want to structure theirs a bit different. But importantly, that can all ladder up to that master overview really easily. So if you do have teams working in different ways or segments of teams on different jobs, you can track that really easily and see what that status looks like depending on how you want to build it, how you want to create it, and what makes sense for you from a data point to track. Again, team A might have initiated in client Y. You saw the automations we set up in option 1 would be exactly the same when it comes to this. The ability to use our repeating cycles here, our due dates, and connecting it always up to our entities and using our estimates and our time tracking. Again, here we might look at running those different views in our teams. So we might say, well, this is our financial statements, and then filtering by that. So we want to say financial statements, and that's what we filter by. Or we can use our different types of work by period. So maybe we did want to create this team board, but we want to see like what's happening quarterly, for example. We can filter now by our time period that we're repeating on. So we can say, let's look at all quarterly tasks across the team, where they're sitting, what do we execute, and what that does. Again, that's going to all ladder back up to our overview to build out that logical and methodical approach to structure. Now that's really the foundations of how you can build out an accounting and bookkeeping workflow for yourself. You can see how we've taken this approach of workspace, folder, database structure where it's static information that you can either have via CRM, connected in via Monday CRM, or leveraging integrations to pull that data in. It becomes really useful from an initiation point for your workflow, but then also triggering different things off the back of that. What you can then create as we look at a full solution that you can utilize as a single installation click is the ability to kind of look down and say, we've got our groups, entities, our contacts, how these are living within our workflows, how we can start to trigger our overview and get full visibility on what's happening with particular clients, tracking our activities and all those different things really seamlessly around here, having our automations that will run our repeating cycles, all that kind of stuff to build out a full solution that makes sense for your organization. Again, if you want to access this, you can click the link in the description to get a hold of it. Hopefully this video has helped you come up with some ideas for structure. You've been able to follow along and build out a workflow that makes sense for your business. And if you want to get in contact with us, please just reach out. I'd love to hear your feedback in terms of what you've built, how it's worked for you, any good things, bad things, and how you've been able to leverage Monday for your accounting or bookkeeping organization.